Welcome back to another session as part of the implementation of strategies. The third session will be on organizational politics. Now, when you remember in session 1 or 2, we looked at the implementation from a rationale point of view and learned that there needs to be clear communication and a clear understanding of how corporate strategies can be cascaded down to the business level and to the functional level. So we looked at some obstacles and we also looked at the 7S approach to find like hardware and software elements that need to be in line when a new strategy comes into place. So elements such as the structure, the culture, also the leadership style, but also the skills of employees all need to be reviewed to make sure that everything is in place for the new strategy to be implemented. And this session will be on organizational politics because we also need to be aware of the factors that influence the effective implementation when it comes to power relations and also political games that exist in any kind of organization. So now on organizational politics. Power and implementation. So the idea of power relations is essential to understanding strategy because power is always relational, so it depends on the relationships that you have with other people. And power characteristics, as you can see, is related to influencing other people to make them do what you want them to do. It's about the influence that you possess about other people. And so in any organization, you need to be aware that there's always power games going on. It's just that power becomes meaningful when it enables you to do certain things that others might be restricted from doing. And you can be both subject and object of power. That means you can influence other people and you can also be influenced by others. And so if someone exercises power, they try to influence others in their will, in their desires, in their actions, in their preferences. And to some extent, we are all engaged in power relations. So we need to be aware of that. And organizations are always tools of and for power. So as a manager, I need to be aware of the power relations and how to manipulate them to help implement the strategy. When we look at the basis of power, so on what basis do power exist in organization? So we have strategic managers and leaders that have position power. That means they are legitimate boss or in a position to possess some power because they are sitting in a certain position in the hierarchy and have been given the power in order to reward, for example, or punish also colleagues. So that's also part of the power they have, but they can also, of course, influence positively through allocation of resources and so on. Then I also have personal power, and that's derived more from the followers based on the leader's behavior. Sometimes I have experts in the field that have a lot of power because they are subject experts, they have a lot of experience, and so they are able to influence others, even though they are not necessarily managers. So only managers can have kind of position power, but you can also have informal leaders, if you like, or employees who can possess some sort of power, for example, expert power. And the another element is the information and connection power. That means if people are well connected, if they have built a network and they can access information fairly quickly, so that also gives them some power. And so we need to be aware of those key players as well in the organization. Remember when we talked about the stakeholders and the power stakeholders have and the interest stakeholders have, that nicely fits in here as well. So you need to identify the key stakeholders in the business, who have the power because either they're experts or because they have the information or the connection to influence others. Yes, you need to get them on board and try to that they support your strategy. That would be very helpful. In terms of implementation and organizational politics is a normal part of organizational life. Yeah, so there will always be an element of politics in there, and here you can see the definition. Organizational politics is the use of organizational resources, such as knowledge, position, or networks, to engage in actions that are strategically self-interested. And that's very important because politics involves the mobilization of support for a position or a decision or an action. So you want to achieve something, usually based on self-interest. And you could say a change in strategy can imply or force a change in politics. And so some employees or other managers might feel that this is threatening because it requires a redistribution of resources. Some managers might lose some of their power because if change happens. So you need to be aware of any counterattacks of managers, that they are not willing to give up the power, that they are trying to manipulate others, that have influence on others to use their power. And so politics come here into play as well. So what you also need to be aware of, that behind every strategy there's a position of interest, and there's a special perspective also coming into play that you need to be aware of. And so and try and understand, as a leader, as a manager, try and understand the other positions of interest. And what do they want to achieve? What is their personal interest? And so that could help you in managing the organizational politics wisely. If the atmosphere is highly political in the organization, then usually the climate is very tense. Jobs are maybe allocated by preferences rather than commercial criteria, and mistakes happen or decline happens, crisis happens because of internal conflicts and mistrust. So politics can also be rather negative, but not only can also be positive. And I will show you or recommend you an article to read at the end of today's session, which is quite interesting and also highlights quite some positive aspects of organizational politics. But yeah, so we have be aware that politics can be very influential to the implementation of strategy. Now let's have a look at some of the underlying reasons for organizational politics. Organizational politics arise because you have usually by nature a hierarchical structure, and you have a structural division in the organization between the different elements and different groups and so on. And so each group forms different values, forms a different climate or organizational culture, and so also develops different styles of working with each other. And so what it means is that if you have lots of different departments and a rather decentralized structure, the more the values and the routines and so on, they vary. And so the more complex it becomes for the leader to deal with. And that relates to the second aspect, and the complexity and the degree of uncertainty as well. So if I have a very highly complex environment, but also a complex structure and a complex organizational setting, then it might be very conducive to organizational politics. Uncertainty comes from the fact that there is a lot of weakness going on, that there's a lot of unknown factors, that's not very transparent, for example, in terms of communication. And so people start gossiping and talking behind each other's back and so on. So because there's some uncertainty, there's no clarity and transparency. And so everybody provides their own opinion, and there are several solutions, different approaches to maybe an issue. And so that degree of uncertainty fosters organizational politics going on as well. The third element or factor that could needs to be considered is the constraints and resources. Imagine you need to bid in some companies or departments need to bid for money, And so if there's some fight for resources, even financial resources, then politics come into play. People try to influence each other positively or negatively, so threatening maybe each other. So because the resources is limited. Imagine also the positions that are available in the career ladder. If you want to advance in the hierarchy of the organization, and it's usually tough relationships between those who aim for higher positions, and the resources are scarce as well. And so politics come very much into play here as well. Another element is the external pressure that comes from stakeholders or other actors or organizations in the environment. So where they try to influence from outside the organization, when you think of customers, or when you think of more influential stakeholders such as competitors. So they put pressure maybe on the organization, and that fosters politics. And the last aspect is the history of past politics. That means how organizations have been dealing with politics and political situations and power relationships. Has it always been like this? So everybody has accepted this kind of game, or is it something that leadership has maybe suppressed? So how is the organization developed? How has it dealt with politics in the past? Due to the culture, but also the leadership. So what managers need to be aware of is that they need to develop the skill set to be able to influence others, to influence decisions, and to participate in organizational politics actively. Because as we said, take this as a given. There's no organization where this doesn't exist. It's just the degree that varies. And as I said, it can be positive and negative. But in any case, managers need to be aware of politics and to try to work with this and deal with them so that they can also pursue their agenda, which is hopefully in the best interest of the organization. So organizational politics is absolutely central to the strategy process. Now, in a related construct that I would like you to be aware of is the principal-agent theory. You can also read about this. That's quite interesting because it makes us aware of how decision-making is divided between the principal and the agent. So the principal is the one who delegates decision-making to someone else, which in this case is the agent. So the principal is maybe the owner of the business or the shareholders of a business, and they hire managers who are the agents here to do decisions on their behalf and to achieve the best possible outcome, which is usually higher share prices and more profit. And so there's this relationship between managers and owners, but also managers and employees. So the principal is the person delegating the authority, and the agent is the person to whom authority is delegated. And you can apply this to different levels. It can be owners and managers, but also managers and employees. So when the CEO, for example, entrusts now a business unit manager as being the agent to use the resources over which they have control in the most effective way in order to maximize performance. Now, there are a couple of issues within that relationship that impact the relationship often negatively, because the agents have always more information about the current situation, the resources that are available, that they are managing because of the day-to-day involvement in the business, than the principals. If you take the owners of the business, they are not involved necessarily. And so agents, maybe unscrupulous agents, can take advantage of such information asymmetry to mislead principals and to maximize their own interest. When you think of some information about customers not demanding the product anymore, or the sales is down, so the manager or even frontline staff, they would know first. And the question is whether they report this immediately to the owner or whether they try to hide this, or whether they try to maybe develop a different idea where they leave the company and found their own business. So because they have this information that the owner doesn't have necessarily, or the principal doesn't have. Another factor is that the principal and the agents have or may have different interests and different goals. So the principal cannot know for sure that the agent is acting in his or her best interest. So they cannot know for sure if the actor is using the resources effectively and efficiently. And so there might be some opportunistic behavior of the managers, and so then this relationship needs to be monitored, but we come to that in a second. The second element is the conflict of interest. That means that as we said, they have different interests and goals, and so that needs to be in line. The owner, the principal, should have a strong interest that these interests are in line. The opportunistic behavior, opportunism, is seeking self-interest with guile. So that means that's an attitude or a set of behavior where the principal doesn't know exactly whether the agent is acting opportunistically or not, again driven by self-interest, and hence the principal needs to establish governance or control mechanisms to prevent agents from acting opportunistically. And then that's why the agency costs come into play here. As a principal, you need to provide some incentives to keep the agents happy and in line with their interest, but you also need to have monitoring mechanisms in place, which will also cost, like for example, to measure performance or to monitor the behavior of agents regularly. And there are also some enforcement costs because there might be a lack of compliance, so you need to have enforcement mechanisms in place as well. So some solutions, as I just mentioned already, so these are some suggestions of how to reduce the conflict. Effective monitoring and control mechanisms could be in place. Greater transparency will definitely help. So people act much more honestly and much more responsibly when they know that they are accountable. Of course, too much transparency can also limit the freedom and spoil the mood. So there needs to be some sort of a good balance between transparent and intransparent communication. But in general, you need to achieve for greater alignment. And so knowledge sharing, for example, could be a mechanism where the organization tries to have again open communication, where issues are shared right away and not really hid, and so they could be addressed right away. And you need to have an appropriate incentive system, like executive compensation system, where you need to create incentives so that the agents are ready to play honest or act honestly and ethically and in the best interest of the principals. So let's summarize what we have covered in lecture 9. We focused very much on strategy implementation, and we learned about that, the best strategy is kind of in vain if the strategy implementation is not planned out and does not consider factors that influence the strategy implementation, such as rational and emotional factors. So we use the 7S framework to identify key areas in a business that needs to be aligned. There are these 7 factors. But we also learned that the emotional part needs to be considered very much so. And so strategic leadership is definitely key, and also the skill set of leaders, for example, in terms of emotional intelligence. So that's a prerequisite to successful implementation, especially because in every organization we have to deal with power relations and organizational politics. Now, as for the reading, please have a look at the textbook, the main textbook at chapter 9. And you can also, again, practice what we have covered with 10 multiple choice questions. And in order to understand the power of organizational politics in more detail, I would like you to read the academic article by Katja Tollo about the positive and negative aspects of organizational politics. And I would like you to answer the following questions. What are the positives and negatives that I mentioned in the paper? But also, what is your personal experience? So try and link your experience to the arguments made in the paper. And how can managers influence organizational politics? Thank you.